Do you believe reality is fixed, stable, controllable? What if I told you it can bend to what you feel, what you choose, or what you hide? There is a place, yes, a real place, where time stops, cell phones die, stars disappear, and the only thing left is you, with yourself. Sound crazy? Good, because every truth begins by seeming impossible. This is the story of ordinary people, a sick veterinarian, 2 young engineers, an elderly couple, 2 insecure brothers, a pastor in a crisis of faith. People with flaws, fears, hidden desires. They embarked on a leisure trip. They returned transformed. Or they never returned. The island swallowed them, stripped them bare, revealed them. There, the forest spoke, the wind reacted to emotions, lies had a scent, and the truth, a consequence. And the most terrifying thing, this can happen to you. It doesn't have to be on an island. It can be in loss, in silence, in a turning point. In life, the question is, if you were to pierce through this fog, what would reality reveal about you? Prepare yourself. What you're about to see isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And perhaps afterward, your life will never be the same. At first, everything seemed like one of those simple summer stories, told around a campfire or saved in a yellowed photo album. A boat, a clear sky, the endless blue horizon. The salty breeze heralded days of rest and reconnection, and the passengers boarded with smiles on their faces and silence in their hearts. The veterinarian, a man marked by compassion and emotional intelligence, sought a break, not just from clinical routines, but from himself, from a fatigue that couldn't be cured with medication. His wife, sensitive and resilient, expected more than the trip itself. She longed to regain the affection that time seemed to have cooled. The brothers, still possessing the innocence that only youth can offer, were restless for adventure, driven by courage, curiosity, and a hint of insecurity. The elderly couple, meanwhile, navigated memories, enjoying the final chapters of a life shaped by humility, love, and gratitude. Also on board were 2 engineering students, united by collaboration and the hope of marking the end of an academic journey with something unforgettable. And then there was the pastor, a man of wavering faith, guided by a sincere impulse to carry his message wherever it was needed. Even if in silence, the vessel sailed on, lulled by the constant song of the waves and the promises of a peaceful destiny. But there, between sips of coffee and scattered conversations, no one imagined they were about to cross an invisible threshold. The sky began to lose its linearity, and a thick mist, dense as longing, rose from the sea as if with a will of its own. The GPS went dark. The compass spun like a confused heart. The captain, experienced and wise, had to draw on the ancient wisdom of the winds, trusting his own intuition more than any instrument. It was as if the island, still hidden, still unspeakable, was calling them with a silent voice, whispering through the cracks of time. There was fear, yes, but there was also something greater. An almost mystical energy hovered over everyone, a kind of raw, primal inspiration, a shock disguised in silence. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. It was as if the known world were saying goodbye without ceremony, and each one, unknowingly, carried something that needed to be revealed, healed, reconciled. A call to the unknown, where the power of kindness, forgiveness, and understanding would no longer be words, but living proof. And then, without warning, the sea vanished from view. The mist swallowed everything. There was no longer north or south, no logic or certainty. The vessel floated between worlds, and time seemed to unravel like an old ball of yarn. There, in that suspended moment, truth began to transform. What was leisure became enigma. What was control became surrender. And without even realizing it, each passenger began an individual journey, not toward a place, but toward themselves. The island was not yet visible, but its presence was already felt like a whisper in their chest, like an ancient memory insisting on returning. They didn't know it, but they were about to enter a territory where intelligence, perseverance, and insight would be more valuable than any compass. A place where humanity would be tested and true innovation would come not from machines, but from choices. The journey wasn't geographic, it was emotional. And like every good story, this one doesn't begin with answers, it begins with a question. One of those that only the soul itself knows how to ask. When the fog began to dissipate, as if respecting the end of a silent act, what appeared before the crew members' eyes was an image bordering on the dreamlike. No trace of civilization, no docks, no houses, no voices. Just a coast covered in dense, virgin, enigmatic forest. Mountains loomed in the background like sentinels shrouded in mist. The silence was so absolute it seemed to scream. As they stepped onto dry land, something even stranger happened. Their clocks stopped as if time refused to be measured there. Their cell phones, even with full battery, went dark without warning. And when night fell, not a single star cut through the pitch-black sky. It wasn't just a nameless place, it was a place outside of time, outside of the world. Corbin, the veterinarian, felt a familiar chill, the kind he'd felt before performing his first euthanasia. His wife Meredith remained silent, her eyes fixed on nothing, as if her soul recognized this place. The elderly couple, Roy and Mabel, walked slowly, respectfully, as if entering a church made of trees. Among them were those who felt the call of curiosity, and those touched by an almost primal fear. Brooke and Tasha, the two engineering students, tried to rationalize everything. They built a makeshift shelter with broad leaves, intertwined sticks, and a covering made of nautical fabric from the boat. It may be an unexplored place, but it's still subject to logic, Tasha insisted, even with strained eyes. Meanwhile, young Caleb, one of the brothers, felt a growing anxiety. His steps were hesitant, and his eyes sought refuge on his older brother, Finn, who remained silent but watchful. The captain, Amos, with his calloused gaze and resilient heart, took the initiative, trying to maintain order and trust in the group. The pastor Elroy remained on his knees, murmuring prayers that remained unspoken, convinced they had crossed into purgatory. The silent island seemed to watch them, not with eyes, but with a presence. And the more they moved, the more they felt themselves being touched not by the forest, but by something much more subtle and profound. The winds, until then calm, began to whistle through the trees as if they had learned to speak. Each footstep echoed differently. Caleb saw footprints disappear before his eyes. Meredith heard whispers calling her name, even though she was alone. Roy and Mabel followed an albino deer to a clearing covered in flowers that seemed to glow. Under the non-existent moon, there was no logic, only intuition. Each of their emotions began to shift almost imperceptibly. Corbin, so rational, felt an unsettling tenderness. Finn, usually calm, began to doubt his own shadow. Brooke, ever practical, fell silent as she watched leaves rearranging themselves on the ground. The island wasn't just soil, trees, and mist. It was a mirror, and everyone was beginning to see more than they wanted. With time suspended and reality distorted, there was no room for masks. Only humanity remained, naked, vulnerable, being shaped. Nature, with its ancient wisdom, welcomed and tested them. And what was merely an arrival revealed itself to be the beginning of a much deeper calling. The days on the island weren't exactly days. The sun rose and set as if following its own clock, impossible to decipher. Each morning, the travelers' faces grew deeper under the shadows, marks not of physical exhaustion, but of the battle waged while they slept. Corbin, the veterinarian, began hearing the voices of animals he had treated in the past. The whisper of a dog run over at age 8, the meow of an elderly cat he had taken in during its final breaths. At first, he thought it was delirium, but the voices carried words he had never heard in life, as if the island translated the animals' feelings into human language. Meredith, his wife, began to dream of the basement of the house where she grew up, reliving with frightening lucidity episodes from her childhood that she herself had locked away in the drawers of her memory. In every twisted tree, he saw his mother's hands, sometimes affectionate, sometimes cold. It was as if the past itself had pitched a tent in the middle of the forest and was ready to visit night after night. Meanwhile, the brothers, Finn and Caleb, watched their bond fracture. Caleb dreamed of giant waves swallowing Finn, while Finn relived scenes of leaving his brother alone out of selfishness or distraction. Guilt, fueled by insecurity, grew like vines around their souls. Amid the tension, lapses of compassion emerged. Small gestures of reconciliation, as if the island, by confronting them with their fears, also sowed affection. Engineers Brooke and Tasha, ever rational, tried to document the phenomena, but each piece of data collected led to more confusion. Footprints that disappeared into the windless sand. Shadows that appeared out of nowhere and crept between the trees without a body. Tasha claimed the pattern of the nocturnal sounds resembled brain waves. Brooke, increasingly distressed, wrote compulsively in a notebook she insisted on wetting with tears. Roy and Mabel remained silent, but Mabel began writing letters to her deceased daughter, saying she felt more alive now than when they were still in the real world. The island became a stage where emotional wisdom was the only accepted language, and fear, the entrance ticket. Elroy, the shepherd, withdrew from the group. He took refuge in a cave near the hillside, where he said he heard trumpets that resonated not in his ears, but in his chest. There, surrounded by moss-covered rocks, he indulged in introspection. He talked to himself, fasted for days, as if awaiting a final judgment. For him, the island was not a place, but a divine test. And perhaps, in part, he was right. The surrounding nature not only surrounded them, it reflected them. Each emotion seemed to trigger an external reaction. Those who felt anger saw the branches sway without wind. Those who expressed gratitude were guided by birds to freshwater sources. It was impossible to hide their feelings. Honesty became a tool for survival. There was no longer any way to ignore loneliness, guilt, or trauma. They had to be faced with courage, with sincerity. And so, like an ancient legend repeated from generation to generation, the island drew, in each person, the contours of an inner journey. And little did they know, what they had begun to confront in their own minds was only the first layer of an even more vivid and watchful mystery. The surrounding forest was not only lush, it was alive, conscious, attentive. Every leaf seemed to carry a secret. Every flower whispered something only the heart could understand. Brooke was the first to notice. Some trees shifted overnight. She swore a twisted mango tree had been 30 meters from the shelter the day before. But that morning, it was there, right at the entrance. Tasha recorded leaf patterns that, at dusk, emitted sounds like musical notes. Roy and Mabel, on one of their afternoon walks, were guided by an albino deer to a secret clearing where time seemed to stand still. Mabel said she felt no pain there. "As if my body remembered what it was like before old age," she whispered emotionally. Corbin noticed something strange as he examined the plants. Some had textures he had never seen before, and touching them made him feel emotions, sadness, joy, fear. As if the island had developed its own form of emotional intelligence, expressed not through words, but through sensations. Relationship between the visitors and the island grew more intimate and unsettling with each passing day. Amos, the captain, found a trail of stones arranged in a spiral, something that hadn't existed the previous morning. Following it, he came across a small pond where a fish leaped. The strange thing? The fish had a face similar to that of an old sailor he'd met decades ago, dead at sea. It was as if the island remembered him too, he murmured, overcome with emotion. Finn began to notice that when he felt anger or frustration, the birds would stop singing and the wind would become dense, almost suffocating. But when he embraced Caleb in a gesture of reconciliation, the sun would break through the clouds. Nature itself seemed to cooperate with those who acted with empathy, humility, and respect. Those who maintained resistance, pride, or arrogance, however, were led down darker, more confusing paths. The island didn't judge like humans, but offered subtly clear answers through the wind, the water, the sounds. At one point, Tasha commented something no one could refute. "We're not the ones exploring the island. It's the ones studying us." And she was right. The answers to her questions came not in words, but in experiences. Those who sought domination were lost. Those who acted altruistically found shelter, food, peace. It was as if every sincere gesture was rewarded with kindness from the landscape itself. Their collaboration became vital. Meredith and Brooke began picking fruit together in silence, creating a connection that transcended words. Roy, even with frail legs, decided to teach Caleb to carve wood, recalling memories of doing so with his own son. Each small act of generosity seemed to strengthen not only the group, but the island itself. The environment molded itself to human emotions, and the understanding took hold. The key to survival there was not to flee or resist, but to understand, adapt, and feel. The natural world became both a mirror and a school, proving that true wisdom lies not in certainties, but in attentive listening to the invisible. And just when everything seemed to make more sense, the deepest secrets would begin to surface. As the days passed, the veil of social interaction began to tear. Silence between the group members was no longer comfortable. It was tense, dense, almost cutting. The island, with its ancient patience, seemed to be waiting for this moment, the instant when the mask of civility would begin to slip, revealing what had been hidden for years. During a particularly sultry night, sitting around a campfire, Corbin, the ever-calm veterinarian, blurted out the secret that weighed more than any backpack. His voice trembled, and his eyes filled with tears as he confessed to Meredith that he was sick, terminally ill. It wasn't the island that would kill him, but time. And he had embarked on this journey as a silent farewell. Meredith, overcome with a mixture of anger, pain, and compassion, walked away, murmuring that the truth can also hurt more than a lie. That confession opened an emotional rift in the group. The air grew heavier. It was as if the island was now listening more attentively, as if saying, "Finally." The next morning, while searching for fruit, Brooke confessed to Tasha that she never wanted to be an engineer. Since childhood, she'd wanted to study philosophy, but she'd given in to her family's expectations. "Logic protected me from the fear of disappointment." Her choked voice revealed a mix of fear and relief. Tasha, surprised, admitted that she too only chose engineering to avoid being left behind. Behind the formulas and calculations lurked deep insecurities, unresolved longings, dreams abandoned out of loyalty to expectations that were never hers. Meanwhile, Elroy, the pastor, approached Meredith and humbly revealed that he had lost his faith years ago. That his sermons were empty rehearsals, repeated out of habit, not conviction. Meredith, still shaken, listened with a mixture of respect and amazement. The island's raw honesty was disconcerting, and there was no going back. Finn, in turn, exploded. In a fit of rage, "You were always the favorite," he shouted at Caleb. "I was the protector, but no one ever asked if I needed to be taken care of too." Caleb was speechless. The silence after that scream was deeper than any prayer. The island reacted. The trees swayed even without wind. A branch fell inches from Amos, who that morning had tried to hide the damaged compass from the others. There was no point in hiding, disguising, or manipulating. The truth had a price, but lying here cost even more. It was as if nature itself were delimiting a field of emotional purification. Those who lied became ill. Those who resisted were lost. But those who surrendered themselves to the process with sincerity found small gifts, illuminated clearings, rare fruits, peaceful inner voices. Roy confessed to Mabel that he had betrayed her trust over 30 years ago. She looked into his eyes and, with disconcerting sweetness, said, "If the island wanted you to tell me, it's because it's time to forgive." That sentence was like a balm. Forgiveness blossomed there, genuine, and the wind blew gently through their white hair. The island didn't punish. The island revealed. She was a mirror of affection, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. And with that, a new understanding was born between them. They weren't just trapped there. They were being prepared for something greater, and the island itself would soon begin to speak their language. Over time, it became clear that the island was not just a silent entity. It spoke, and it spoke a lot, but not with words, but with symbols, patterns, and sensations. Brooke was the first to spot a strange spiraling pile of stones near the clearing, where a dead bird had been buried. Tasha, skeptical at first, began to notice that the fallen leaves formed symbols reminiscent of ancient inscriptions, as if the forest itself were writing. Meredith, during a solitary walk, heard the sound of a lullaby her grandmother used to sing, but there was no one around. Caleb claimed to have seen leaves floating in perfect circles over a calm lake, while Finn swore he heard his name whispered by the wind. It was clear that the island wanted to be understood, but it only revealed itself to those willing to observe with empathy, with emotional intelligence, with humility. Every detail now seemed charged with intention, and those who listened with their hearts truly listened. The engineers, determined to better understand the signals, began studying the patterns. Brooke created a cataloging system with visual symbols, stones in a line, overlapping leaves, crossed branches. Tasha searched for sonic rhythms in the melodies of the winds. And then, they began to notice something extraordinary. Every time they respected certain rituals, sleeping to the sound of the wind, not crossing certain rivers at dusk, not picking unripe fruit, the island seemed to reward them. Fruit ripened faster. Birds left colorful feathers in front of the shelter. Trails previously invisible appeared as if by magic. It was as if nature itself was educating them in a new type of communication. A language where the reward came for collaboration, wisdom, and kindness. The entire group got involved. Corbin offered wild honey to a tree before plucking one of its leaves. Elroy, even in his spiritual mourning, began to sing ancient hymns. Without lyrics, just melody, and flowers bloomed around him. Even Roy, who could barely move due to his age, learned that touching 3 rocks before walking made his legs hurt less. It was as if the island were saying, "I see you." But not everyone listened. When one of the sailors, Willard, a withdrawn, suspicious, and quick-tempered man, decided to hunt a rare bird on the island out of sheer hunger and recklessness, something changed. The birdsong ceased for 2 full days. The sky remained cloudy, the fruit rotted on the branches, and Willard disappeared. He vanished without a trace. Only a pile of misshapen rocks was found near the last place he had been seen. The lesson was hard. Human arrogance was not tolerated there. The island was not cruel, but it was firm. Like a wise grandmother who does not accept disrespect, even if the heart is full of love. From that moment on, everyone understood. Living there required profound respect, patience, and sensitivity. One had to shed the logic of control and clothe oneself in the cloak of observation and gratitude. Each day became an exercise in emotional and spiritual interpretation. And the more they learned to listen, the more it became clear that the island wasn't just a place, it was a consciousness. And soon, it would lead them to something none of them were prepared to face: the fall of the ego. It was during a strange evening, when the sky seemed to breathe along with the forest, that everything began to change. The temperature suddenly dropped, and the colors of the world seemed to fade. The sun, without warning, began to hide behind a celestial shadow, a total eclipse. This was no ordinary thing. The darkness wasn't just visual. It was a darkness of the soul. as if each person were being sucked into themselves with no escape. Caleb fell to his knees and cried like never before, without knowing why. Brooke stood paralyzed, mentally replaying all the time she'd pretended to be strong just to avoid disappointing others. Corbin, weak and dejected, murmured the name of a friend he'd lost decades ago and had never had the courage to visit in. The hospital. The island in that moment pulled them inward, not to the geographic center, but to the center of their own being. It was the end of denial. It was confrontation. An unannounced but inevitable ritual where the ego could no longer hide. Roy and Mabel, who until then had maintained a more contemplative presence, surprised everyone. They walked to the center of the clearing and danced, as if they had grown 30 years younger. Roy said his feet felt light, like when he met Mabel at a church dance in Illinois. She laughed with the lightness of someone who no longer carried guilt or pain, only love. Elroy, the pastor, remained seated, but his eyes were different. For the first time since they had set foot on the island, he seemed at peace. He closed his eyes and murmured a wordless prayer, an act of faith without form, only presence. He had rediscovered the sacred, not in the scriptures, but in the acceptance of life in all its complexity. Tasha found a notebook among the roots of a tree, old and yellowed. It was a journal. It belonged to someone named Ellis, an engineer, lost there decades before. It described similar phenomena, mystical encounters, and a cycle of arrival, transformation, and disappearance. That confirmed it. The island was no accident. It was a testing ground, a test of humanity, a ritualistic mirror of redemption. The clearing was illuminated by a pale, strange light, as if the universe itself were observing what was happening there. And all the while, something subtle yet powerful was transforming everyone. Meredith approached Corbin and said simply, "I don't forgive you for dying, but I forgive you for trying to hide it from me. Because now ... I understand." Their embrace was silent, tender, full of understanding and reconciliation. Finn held Caleb's hand firmly and apologized for having arrogantly assumed the role of protective brother. Caleb, tears streaming down his face, replied, "I needed to hear that." It was as if the island had been waiting for this eclipse, not only to demonstrate its power, but to illuminate, amidst the darkness, the human capacity for healing and resilience. And so, without promises, without angels, without clitched miracles, just with humanity, everyone was reborn a little. But the eclipse, with its ancient wisdom, also made it clear this was only halfway. The invisible judgment, the one not made with words, was about to begin. In the weeks following the eclipse, something shifted in the island's vibe. It wasn't something you could see with your eyes, but something you could feel in your bones, in your dreams, in the pauses of thought. The days seemed longer, as if time were waiting. And little by little, clues emerged that this group wasn't the first. Elroy found a makeshift cross covered in moss. Roy found pieces of torn canvas next to an old military belt. Tasha excavated the remains of a rudimentary hut, while Caleb, further away from the group, stumbled upon something that made him freeze, a partially buried skeleton, still wearing its boots. No one spoke for minutes. The silence was almost sacred. And then Captain Amos, who had been studying the island's behavior for days with the insight of someone who had survived many storms, made the connection no one wanted to hear aloud. Perhaps the island only releases those who transform. The words sounded like a sentence, a bitter yet inevitable truth. Then began the time of confrontation, not with monsters, but with one's own choices. Corbin spent days reevaluating every decision he had made in life, writing letters that would never be sent. Meredith, in a moving gesture of initiative, burned the photos of the past she had hidden in her suitcase. She said that now only the present mattered, the one built with affection and truth. Brooke and Tasha, increasingly connected, abandoned their technical journals, and began painting island symbols on rocks, as if finally translating the new language they had learned. Finn and Caleb created a small wooden altar where they left objects symbolic of what they wanted to leave behind. Roy spent days lighting small fires and reciting poems to Mabel as a way of thanking her for the years of silent forgiveness she had offered him. It was clear the judgment didn't come from outside. It was internal, invisible, but relentless. It was the island itself, with wisdom, leading each person to the limit of their ego, so that they could choose consciously between remaining who they were or becoming who they could be. And it wasn't easy. Some couldn't handle it. A sailor, Dwight, became delirious, convinced the island was an alien trap. He disappeared into the forest and was never seen again. Meredith spent 3 days isolated, in total silence, until she emerged from the woods, with her eyes shining with resilience and a smile that showed she had finally accepted her own vulnerability. Elroy developed a violent fever. They said he was delirious, muttering biblical passages mixed with the name of the island, which no one knew, but everyone felt. When he returned, he no longer spoke. He simply smiled with a serenity no one had seen in him before. The island revealed, understanding heals, pride sickens, forgiveness liberates, denial imprisons. With every choice, a sign. With every gesture of honesty, a path opened. No one expected miracles anymore. They only hoped to be worthy of moving forward. And amidst this new way of life, something began to form in the mist on the horizon. A silhouette, a sail, a hull of vessel. But now, the dilemma was no longer just leaving the island. It was knowing if they were ready for what would come next. What began as a distant whisper on the sea gradually became confirmation of something impossible. A new vessel was approaching. The sail, bent and torn, danced in the wind like a warning. It was an old, rusty vessel, but alive as if it had been led there not by the logic of navigation, but by the will of the island itself. The group, now much quieter than at first, watched the new boats approach without the excitement they once had. Finn clenched his fist tightly. Caleb, beside him, whispered a prayer that mixed gratitude and doubt. Corbin held Meredith's hand, with a tenderness he had never shown in years of marriage. That boat wasn't just a means of escape. It was a mirror. It showed who they had been when they arrived there, anxious, fragile, impulsive. And now each had to decide. Return to the old world or remain in a place where everything had changed, including themselves. The new visitors who disembarked seemed to repeat the past. Hurried voices, lost looks, technical questions. Among them was a woman named Reagan, dressed in hiking gear, but with fearful eyes. A young man named Milo, speaking too loudly as if trying to hide his insecurity. A skeptical woman, Naomi, demanding rational explanations. The group already living on the island watched them silently, with understanding. There was no judgment, only the wisdom of those who had walked these same steps. Elroy was the first to approach. He handed Reagan a fruit that only bloomed after. The rains, he said nothing. He just smiled. Roy and Mabel offered shelter. Brooke and Tasha pointed the way to the water source. Every gesture, a symbol. Every action, a choice. Generosity now was natural. The power of kindness manifested itself in small actions. It was the island teaching through its own students. And in that moment, they understood. Their journey was not over. It had merely changed form. Some, like Finn and Meredith, began packing their belongings. They decided to return, to take with them what they had learned and try to live outside with the same level of humanity they had discovered. Others hesitated. Corbin, even though ill, said it might be better to die there, where he felt peace. Caleb wanted to stay a little longer. Elroy refused to leave. Roy and Mabel, after a long conversation filled with tears and laughter, decided that this was indeed their final home. The island had become home, sanctuary, prison, school, depending on how you looked. At it, there was no right or wrong, only choices. The boat set sail, this time with less than half the original crew. But those who remained did not cry. And those who left did not look back with sadness, but with a sense of mission accomplished. The crossing had been made inside and out. And just as the tide ebbs and flows, what lay ahead was the last leg of the journey, returning to the world they came from and discovering if there was still room for all they had become. The return to civilization was without fanfare or explanation. The boat anchored in a small port in North Carolina, and those who disembarked were greeted with curious but indifferent looks. None of the survivors could explain how they got there. There were no records of the island, no coordinates, no plausible ocean currents. When they tried to tell their stories, they were met with disbelief. They called it a collective hallucination, a psychological trauma. The real world, with its busy schedules, social media, and noisy traffic, was unprepared to hear stories about talking trees and emotions that shape nature. Corbin spent his final months in a hospital, refusing invasive treatments. He asked only for silence, hot tea, and paper to write. His writing, full of emotional intelligence and hope, touched nurses, patients, even strangers. Meredith, who had stayed by his side until the end, returned to life, but with a different frequency. He sold flowers at the local market and taught children to meditate with stones. He said he was not a therapist, he was a survivor. And that was enough. Finn, ever observant, became a writer. He published a book called Where the Wind Doesn't Scream, in which he told a fantastical story inspired by a place that doesn't exist. The book became a bestseller, but he never gave interviews. Caleb, on the other hand, disappeared, never seen again. Some say he moved to Alaska, others claim he returned to the island, but no one knows how. Tasha and Brooke disappeared from the radar after a series of lectures on bioarchitecture and natural intelligence. They left behind a notebook with sketches of structures inspired by the island's vegetation. Roy and Mabel, elderly, bought a mountain cabin and lived in silence, watching the sunset. They received few visitors, but welcomed anyone with herbal tea and words of resilience, gratitude, and wisdom. Elroy? He never spoke again. But everyone he passed said they felt something different, as if he carried, in his eyes, the very essence of humanity. He walked the streets like a monk at peace, with the serenity of one who has been judged and chosen love. And so, the island was left behind, not on maps, but in memories. Not on routes, but in souls. Those who returned were no longer the same. They carried fragments of a place that defied logic, but taught the essential. They lived between two worlds, one made of concrete and bills, the other made of wind, silence, and understanding. And even as they tried to move on, something inside them always returned. A smell, a sound, a dream. The island, after all, was never just a physical space. It was a catalyst, a living metaphor, an invitation to transformation. Those who passed through it now carried the courage to face what truly matters. They had seen their ego dissolve, their lies rot, their fears melt away. They had learned the value of empathy, kindness, initiative, and overcoming. And they knew, even if they could never return, that the island would live on within them, silent, attentive, waiting for the next lost heart that dared to cross the missed dot. And now, after crossing this island with your mind and heart, tell me, what did you see in yourself? What truths are you hiding, postponing, putting off? Because the great truth is that you don't need a ghost island in the middle of the ocean to change your life. The true calling is within you right now. How many times has life given you subtle signs that you ignored? How many times has the nature around you, the people by your side, your own emotions tried to show you that something needed to change? The difference between moving forward or staying lost isn't in the circumstances, it's in the choices. What will you do with everything you felt here? Will you let this story die with the last word? Or will you use this mirror to transform your reality? If this story affected you, and I know it did, then you are part of this cycle. Comment below. What was the moment that touched you most? Which character resembled you? Share this. Sharing is also an act of generosity. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you more stories like this full of emotion, reflection, inspiration, and truths no one has the courage to share.